Okay, hello everyone. My name is Pontus Westerberg. I work for UN Habitat, which is the UN Program for Sustainable Cities, the United Nations Human Settlements Program. And in this panel discussion, we're going to discuss access and human rights in the smart city. Maybe a little bit different to some of the discussions that have happened so far. But we think that actually technology, the way it's worked in cities is really important. And the background to this panel and why we decided to do it is because the UN member states got together in Quito, Ecuador, in a big global conference on cities called the Habitat 3 in October last year. And in that conference, they all agreed a kind of vision for how cities will work and be developed to be sustainable over the next 20 years. It's called the New Urban Agenda. It's very broad. It looks at many different issues to do with cities, governance, planning, basic services. It's universal, all countries. The New Urban Agenda also mentions smart cities, and it actually urges member states to adopt a smart city approach to urbanization. But it doesn't define what smart cities actually is. And so this is something that needs to be done, and we thought that SIF would actually be a good opportunity to continue that discussion with some really interesting people that are here. So that's going to be the purpose of this discussion. We've got a fantastic panel. I'd like to introduce them now first. We have Eva Blum de Montet. She's a researcher for the London-based charity Privacy International. And she conducts research on surveillance and data-intensive systems with a focus on South America, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. Okay. We have Kelsey Finch. She's a policy counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum. She works on smart cities and smart communities, de-identification standards, consumer wellness and wearable devices, and data ethics. Then we have Johan Lindstad. He's the global director for smart sustainable cities at Ericsson. He's previously worked in almost every Ericsson market in Latin America. Then we have María Canales. She's executive director of Derechos, digitales, an attorney at law specialized in the subject of technology and fundamental rights. And finally, we have Jack S.M. Key. She's head of the Women's Rights Program at the Association on Progressive Communication. She's a feminist activist and researcher working on the interconnection between human rights, digital network technologies, and feminism. Welcome, all of you. The first thing I wanted to do was actually start discussing this concept, smart cities, and see what the panel thinks. I think we'll go through a round, starting with Eva, to see what do we actually consider this concept to be.
Well, actually, I think this is interesting that while there is such a craze for smart cities, we're still struggling to define it and to understand what it is. And so I work with actually a fairly simple working definition of smart cities. I understand smart cities to be the use of data collection to provide services or so-called improved services. Now, services can be anything from a greener city, better government services, to actually targeted advertisements. And this is what's interesting, is that actually, if you ask yourself, or if you ask around you, people around you, do you live in a smart city? Most people say, no, I don't. Like, I don't know anyone who says, yeah, I definitely do. I live in a smart city. No, I haven't. And yet, yeah, this is the truth. The truth is that we almost all do. Almost anyone who lives in a large city will live in a smart city, because in most large cities at the moment, there is to some extent a process of data collection for the purpose of services. And I think this points to a very specific problem, which is the way citizens and civil society has been excluded from this debate around smart cities. And I was reading the white paper from Ericsson on their vision for smart cities, and it talks a lot about, involving civil society and involving citizens. But the reality of the current scene around smart cities is just not that. We see two major actors. We see, on the one hand, large corporations, IBM, Oracle, Ericsson, And on the other hand, we see local and national governments. And, you know, I think there's a wealth of examples on how, citizens have been kept out of this. I think an interesting one from London, where I live, is the way smart trash cans were installed in the city of London, which is our business district. And what those trash cans were doing is that they were broadcasting advertisements, but the trick was that it was also intercepting data. So when you would walk by the trash can, the data from your phone was being intercepted. And when people realized that, it caused absolute outrage, and the trash cans had to be removed. And I think what was interesting was the reaction of the CEO of the company, who said, "I don't understand why people are suddenly outraged, because London's already the most surveilled city in the world." But I think this is what's interesting about smart cities. It redefines the way we think about privacy, and it redefines human rights in general. And so this is why I wanted to go back to the title of this talk, which is Human Rights in the Smart Cities. Because whose human rights are we talking about? Are we talking about IBM's vision of human rights? Are we talking about Ericsson's vision of human rights? Are we talking about the Indian government's vision of human rights? Are we talking about the Chinese government's vision of human rights? Because what's clear is that in situations where civil societies and citizens are being kept out of this debate, it's certainly not all visions of human rights that are being discussed. And in that context, there are questions to be raised around, around exclusion, specifically for that reason. And there's a very interesting study that was published recently in France about the experience of women in cities, and how women live and experience the city in a completely different way than men. So whereas men see public spaces and cities as a place to hang out, to chill, women experience the city as a way to get to point A to point B, and this is actually largely the result of patriarchy, but more specifically of the question of street harassment. And so who is making the smart cities? Because at the moment we don't know. As I said, while Ericsson has this, on paper, very positive attitude, there's recently a deal signed on Istanbul to provide smart city infrastructure in Istanbul. So I was quite interested. Considering Turkey is currently a country where academics and journalists are jailed when they oppose the government. When we know what the reality of smart cities are like at the moment, I was quite curious to see what exactly was the content of the deal and the content of what was provided. And I couldn't possibly find it. And I find it problematic.
That's really useful. We'll give you a moment to respond in a second. But what about you, Kelsey? What about you? How do you see the definition of smart cities?
Okay, hopefully this is working. I think that I'm going to punt because I'm from the privacy community and we can't figure out what privacy means. We can't figure out what personal information is. We've spent, decade after decade, and we haven't moved the ball that much forward. But I think there's sort of two different aspects to this that I think are worth a little bit more nuance or complication, which is that, so the smart side of smart cities is that, as you said, it's using data to provide services. But by that definition, governments have been smart since time immemorial. Shopkeepers and local governments have been running censuses, have been tracking who buys things on credit. They've been keeping local sort of analog lists. You know who is in your small community. You know what they do and you know who they are. And we've taken it to a broader scale. So I think that the aspect of technology is an important part of this definition as well, not just the data. And it's finding ways to tease out where that line is that feels invasive, or where the technology is, or the data being collected is so granular or so conveyed in real time, and that there are some qualitative differences to the data being acted on from historical decision-making within local governments. I think that's worth keeping in mind. And then the other part of this is that cities is, I think, a useful way for us to speak about it, and it's certainly sort of the broad narrative, but it's not just urban environments that are growing with this technology, and it's not just urban environments that we need to be thinking about privacy for. It's local communities, it's regions, it's nations. So this technology is being adopted on all scales and can benefit folks at all levels of government. And so we need to be paying attention to not just cities, not just urban environments, although those are currently the ones on the front sort of the forefront of these things, but we need to think about communities generally as we go forward. So there you go.
Thanks. What about you, Joanna? I think, Eriksson, you actually have a definition that you use.
We do have a definition. It's working? Yeah.
So, yeah.
So our definition is a smart city is a city that uses ICT, and we narrow it down to that because we are a tech company, that uses ICT to solve or try to solve social, economical, or environmental problems. And by doing so, improving the standard of living or the living conditions for the citizens in the city. That's our simple definition. Now, we recognize that if you really want a smart city, you also need smart citizens. And of course, that means a lot around education, possible access to academia, all these type of things. But as a company, we cannot reach all of this, so we focus on the ICT side of it.
Thanks. What about you, María?
Hey, thank you for the invitation first. I think it had been already said that the main conception that we have right now about smart cities, about data collection that allows to improve in some way the form in which the service that provided by public or public entities. But I think that another interesting definition of a smart city, it's about control. The need of a smart city comes from the idea that the cities, the urban space have grown so big that in some way there are some things that are not efficient anymore as they were in the more smaller scale of local communities. So at the end, smart cities, it's not that it's not true that they fulfill what my colleagues have mentioned, but it's also a lot about how it's an attempt to try to take control of certain variables that the scale of population in the big city had made difficult to handle. And in that sense, we need to be aware that the very fact that this is made for controlling this variable give like a lot of potential to use that control for other purposes that are not so well intended or so fortunate as the one that my colleague just mentioned. So in that sense, it's where I plug the topic of the conversation today, that it's what precisely provide the opportunity to keep the concept of smart city in a right framework. It's to add to the analysis of the building of the smart city, the human rights consideration and the need of engage of the different stakeholders of this urban space in the construction of the definition of what we want for a smart city, or how smart do we want it. And even as some of my colleagues pointed out in a paper last year, maybe we could arrive to the democratic conclusion that we want to live in a dumb city. And it's also very valid, but the thing is that we will never know if we don't engage in that conversation in a more diverse way with the different constituencies of the city. And that's also very connected with something that it's also in the topic of the talk, that is the access part. A smart city is principally intended for control, but the control is intended for efficiency. So what we will do with all the citizens that don't fit in that paradigm of a city being completely efficient, we will leave them behind. How the smart city take care of that part of the analysis is really relevant to understand that access, it doesn't mean necessarily access to the service, which is the main point that is pointed out for the government, by the governments and the companies that offer services to build these smart cities, but it's also about how we don't leave certain traditionally excluded groups out of this progress that the smart city intended to provide.
Thanks. Jack, do you have something to add? Should we take one of them?
Plan B.
this working? Yeah, okay. Okay, so all the good definitions have been taken. I'm left with a summary. It's an interesting thing. And for me, my entry point into coming into this is smart cities have been mentioned a lot in relation to development, especially in developing contexts. So for me, there's 4 components to the definition. One is that it is a specific initiative or a project. Resources are pumped into it. It's being driven also as part of the development project, that this is really good for development. We're trying to foresee problems, etc., etc. That's one. The second part to it is that it is part of the conversation on urban regeneration and development already, regardless of whether it's smart or not. So this is an existing conversation that's happening, and then something smart is plugged into it. So what is this smart thing? This smart thing then is the third component, which is where data collection, extraction, analysis, and decision-making is being made to try and solve specific problems, to foresee and respond to specific problems, whatever this may be. So from sanitation to kind of issues around crime to transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And then fourthly, it's about data. It's a data-augmented way to regulate spaces within a city. So it's really also about the notion of space. What is a city? What is it? What are the spaces within the city that a smart city is really trying to regulate and improve through data collection? Which then brings to the interesting point of who's then imagining, right? Like, what are these spaces and who's responsible for it? And generally, it's maybe local municipality or some sort of governance. And it's about, this is my responsibility, these are spaces in which I have to care for, here are resources in which I need to plan, etc., etc. And when you, it's not always also just the public service or just the public, not just the government's area of responsibility. There's always a sideways, right, in terms of corporations being involved as well. So whether this is subcontracting public services, public transport services, or subcontracting sanitation and trash and water and blah, 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 there's always been a private sector involvement. But when you link it up to very explicitly data collection and so forth, then we have Ericsson sitting here, who's a major stakeholder, and possibly other local stakeholders as well. So that brings questions around governance and governance structures, and which is what you were also talking about in terms of where then is the civil society participation in this. But before I go there, maybe take 2 steps back and think about this notion of space and public spaces within a city. And what is this idea of a public space and the use and the utility of a public space? And then also go back to kind of our research and thinking that's been done around critiquing initiatives around urban regeneration and development projects already. So public spaces have been critiqued as being neglected. Not enough resources is being put into public spaces for it to be useful for the public. It's being critiqued as being segregated, so public spaces being fenced off, being used for only particular groups of society. It's being critiqued as being unsafe. So public spaces are spaces of fear. It's spaces where it's very scary, so we need to make it more safe. And it's also being critiqued as homogenized, where we imagine public spaces to just be one kind of a space for one kind of a people, and all urban dwellers to just be pretty much the same people. And then that begs the question of actually whose utility is it for? What is the framework of this utility of a public space? What do we imagine public spaces, who do we imagine public spaces to be useful for, to what end? And I think there is also a very interesting kind of push towards public spaces, as you said, no? To be efficient, to be productive spaces, to be spaces that actually fulfills a particular kind of neoliberal capitalist aim, right? It's kind of what it is for. It's for productive citizens to do productive things. There's no kind of unproductive public space. Even spaces for leisure is kind of productive spaces of leisure. Yeah, have a coffee shop there, a tourist space here. Maybe we put a mural there so that more tourists can come. So then there's kind of like, you know, this notion of where do smart cities also engage with notions of public spaces for different kinds of utility? And who's part of this conversation in terms of even the framing of it? What is it for? And then in this framing, that's where it becomes important. If you talk about development, what development risks is that you lose human rights in the conversation. Because development is almost sometimes being put in you want to talk about people, but you don't want to talk about people with rights. You want to talk about people in the way that is a little bit more softer, no? Like we want to help them. It's for their development. And I think this framing notion and for this session, it's actually quite critical that we also cast a bit of a lens to that. Like, what's this framing?
Thanks a lot. So I think there is definitely some agreement that it's about digital technology, it's about data, but also then you start getting these issues that come up about control, about top-down, about who has rights, who has access, and so on. Is it the private companies? Is it only the local government? What about civil society and so on? I want to follow up by asking you, Anna, so Ericsson has this network society vision, which says that everything that can be connected will be connected in the future. That's obviously going to generate lots and lots of data, and you can think about Internet of Things and sensors that are out there somehow collecting data. But aren't there risks about violating people's human rights, privacy, spying, these kind of issues? How do you see that?
Our vision about the network society is that everything that can take advantage of being connected will be connected, so that not everything, but everything that can get an advantage out of it will be connected. And yes, that means that, well, we had a slogan of 50 billion connected devices, which means at least 50 billion connected real world things. You will have a lot of data. And I don't think we should be necessarily afraid of just that this data is collected. But what we're seeing is that the analytics will start correlating data from all these devices and draw conclusions that we might not even be aware of ourselves. And that is, of course, the data that can become dangerous. I don't have the perfect solution for that. I don't think this is something that really can be stopped. So we need to organize and structure the society to handle it. And I also think that anyone that believes that we can guarantee that no one will actually break in and get access to data they should not have access to is possible. So what we focus on is to guarantee that if someone got access to data they shouldn't have access to, we can trace that this has happened. What was touched, how was it touched, was it modified? Because one thing is that someone enter in a place and actually start looking at data. Another thing is if they go in and change those data without anyone being aware, because that can result in real bad harm. For instance, if someone modifies your pictures of where you have been, you can end up in court in the wrong side of the bar. So those times are the real challenges we are working on. Now, we see big differences between different societies. If you look at having camera monitoring in the cars, for instance, Singapore has had that for ages. You have a camera in the car, so if you have an accident, you can easily say what happened. In Sweden, that had to go up to the Supreme Court before you're actually now just allowed to have a camera on when you drive in the car. So there's a big difference from cities to cities, from countries to countries, how they handle it. The third thing we are seeing is that a lot of this is connected to cloud. Storage in the cloud, and a lot of the solutions that are coming out, they don't store your data when you pass that garbage can in UK. They store it in a database maybe in US, which means that data goes over the borders. So even if a government really wants to control their data, they might not actually sit on that data. And we see that most of the cities are very worried about this. How can they guarantee that these data don't flow around on a totally uncontrolled way? So most of them actually wants to have their data in their own basement where they can actually touch it. Of course, that might not work in the real world.
Yeah, thanks. Eva, you had some kind of critique of this data gathering that some local authorities, national governments, and companies like Ericsson are doing. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you pointed out the problem. The problem is the mass data collection that arises, but also beyond this, the problem of analytics and artificial intelligence, and the fact that the reason we're collecting all this data is to make assumption about people, because based on the assumption we make about people, we can have targeted services for them, targeted advertisement for them, but are citizens going to be satisfied with this kind of choice that are made based on those assumptions? To give just one among many examples of these assumptions that are being made, it was the case of advertisement for engineering jobs that were not being advertised for women, because based on the intelligence that had been gathered, women would not be interested in this kind of advertisement. But just more generally, the fact that we have companies that are involved in setting up the infrastructures of the cities, like Ericsson, like IBM, which are now going to be also in control of this data. We see that IBM is, for example, using this data to run tests on Watson, which is their artificial intelligence program. So again, how do we feel about it? How do we feel about having corporations just gathering, sitting on this data, and potentially, you know, using it or not using it, but being in control of it effectively? And the other question is, as you mentioned, the issue of security. I live in the UK. I saw hospitals being shut down this weekend because of a cyber attack. And clearly, this just shows the problem we're facing, is that we're sleepwalking into a world where everything we've built is more and more relying on data collection, and yet we're not capable yet of adequately protecting this data. And this is something that I wish would be a lot more discussed when we talk about smart cities. It's just purely the security of the devices we deploy. When we install sensors in cities that are there to intercept noise, so we can intercept gunshots and we can have the police reacting more quickly to a gunshot, how do we know those sensors are not being used to intercept the conversations of people in the streets?
Yeah, I mean, these are really valid concerns. Kelsey, you wrote a paper a couple of years ago called Welcome to the Metropticon, which kind of looks at some of these things and I think tries to come up with a way forward.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation, and I think part of it is bringing in diverse voices. And so obviously privacy, security in smart cities is a huge concern. It's probably not the top one that folks list in their policies and statements, but it makes it in there. It's sort of that same vision that if you lose trust in these technologies, if citizens feel violated, if harms flow from this instead of data being used for good purposes, the whole structure will collapse down around you. And on the sort of the scale of the data that we've seen, you end up with things like hospitals shutting down. The waves of bad results will just sort of ripple outward. But so there's also a lot of really interesting, smart cities raise new concerns and old concerns from a privacy perspective. So a lot of it's just scale. You have concerns about securing data, about ensuring that there's sort of privacy policies or transparency into it. But you also have, because this is a mediated sort of government space as well, you run into issues about, so if you can't opt out of living in a smart city. If these are public spaces at some level, your data is going to be collected and used for certain things based on the decisions of your elected officials or whoever's running the government these days. And so in those spaces, a privacy policy might not be sufficient. You might need to go to some additional transparency mechanisms. Sort of consent becomes very tricky to determine whether it's truly voluntary or where it's truly valid. But in place of that, you turn towards other mechanisms, sort of ethical review processes, sort of the traditional apparatus of making decisions for groups of people who all live in the same area. So public hearings and fora and neighborhood level discussions, and making sure that you do things in a diverse variety of manners so that you can get to diverse populations that happen to live next to each other and will be in this impacted area. And so you see cities starting to try this out, and sort of project by project and city by city, people are experimenting. Sort of in the same way that they are with the technologies, they're experimenting with what are the best practices for privacy and security. And I don't think that we necessarily have everything right yet, but it's encouraging to at least see that process continuing to evolve and folks talking to each other and sharing what they've learned. And so I think that I think that trend will continue and we'll keep going in that direction. So paths forward are around things like transparency and engaging the citizens. So the more that you can go to people and ensure that these are solutions that they want and that will be helpful for their lives, and you can show a concrete benefit, the less scary the data collection becomes. The more that you can tailor the data collection and you can minimize it to only what you need for a particular project, the more that you've comported with the FIPS and general privacy principles. And then sort of having robust sort of traditional privacy practices like strong de-identification, which is never going to be perfect. There's still going to be some risk that you can, suss an individual out of the data set, but, we can try to lower that risk as much as we can. You have, sort of vendor management tools. So if you don't trust, the technology companies that are putting these tools into place, require audits, require additional accountability mechanisms, and make sure that you actually follow up and check on those. And then make sure that you share those practices with others who might be running into similar issues. Because there isn't a huge pool of people doing this yet. And I think sort of an interesting thing to keep aware of in this space is that everybody is looking to everybody else for privacy answers, or assumes that the other party at the table may be better suited to handle those tricky questions. So, you know, even very big cities will assume that Ericsson or the technology providers have in-house counsel. They do this all the time. This is their product. They're used to doing the compliance around privacy. The technology company might say, no, you're the government. You have your own privacy, regimes to follow. You know better. You're the customer. Tell us what you want us to do, and we'll do it. And so you get this really weird trade-off where nobody's actually holding the ball, and then you end up with sort of downstream effects of startup companies offering smart city services are just going to copy what they see like sort of the larger companies doing, or smaller cities will copy sort of what they see larger cities doing, or assume that, we've seen boilerplate contracts in like the education space make it into, which blatantly violate the laws that they're supposed to be holding, but nobody really paid attention to that when they were negotiating the deal. So we're going to have to see sort of an evolving privacy literacy and infrastructure before we can get that aspect of it right.
Thanks. I just want to let you respond directly to that comment.
Just a quick comment, because I think it's very important what you're raising there. And at least in our company, we have, for every deal we want to go into in smart cities, there's a separate board that will look at the ethics of that deal. And you mentioned the Turkish case, and they were very much involved in, we are providing just consulting in Turkey at the moment. And they went through it very clearly and set certain guidelines. If the city wants to go in these directions, you cannot. So we have that mechanism, and we have to go through that approval process that is on a very high level before we are allowed to go into these type of projects. That doesn't make us perfect in any way, and it doesn't mean that the city could not use the data in an unethical way after they have it, but at least it provides some mechanism inside the company for avoiding us to blatantly just do what the city or the country asks us.
Maria, you work with people's fundamental rights on the internet. How do you think that smart cities can be built taking people more into consideration, perhaps being more bottom-up?
Yeah, the first thing that I'm missing from what we just heard, it's that all the discussion and the conversation appears to be framing in what, like, measures of diminishing the risk of harm we are taking when we are engaging in the building of the smart city. But I don't see that really there is a highlight of the previous stage, which is that the decision making of what we understand for the smart city that we want. So I think that it's not that the problem about smart city and the respect of human rights start in what we do with the data, but start before, when we decide which kind of data from the citizen we want to collect, and how that it's really useful for the purpose of building a city that it's in service of allow those citizens to fulfill the complete exercise of their own human rights. So that's the first question that we need to make it. That's one stage before than we have been discussing so far in what my colleagues just highlight. Because it's more about how in this conversation that Kelsey was mentioning, it's not that just in one side have to be the local government or the regional government, whatever authorities engage, and the other side the company, thinking top down what they want for a smart city. What we need here is an engagement more at the community level to understand first and make the diagnosis of what are the needs that really need to cover, and just when you detect that need, really make the decision of what kind of data is the minimum that you need to fulfill that need. And we are starting exactly in the opposite way. You were saying there's a million of number of devices connected, so just go to collect all the data that they provide because it's already available. And that's not the question. The question comes before. For what do you want that? Is really necessary to cover all that data, or we can do it, we can achieve the same reasonable goals that we want for efficiency of the city, for providing better services with less of that information collected? That's the real question for me from a human rights perspective, that have that two also layers, the layers of how that it's useful for exercise of human rights, and how the process itself of building this idea of smart city consider the exercise of the democratic rights of people that belong to the community. So they need to be part of the conversation and not just receive what the authorities and the companies consider that is the right vision of the future of the city.
Yeah. Jack, what do you think? I mean, if we start bringing people in the sense, then we get into issues with digital divide, for example. The last World Bank World Development Report digital dividends show that basically, despite increased access to technology, poor people are still poor. People without access are still without access, and so on. What do you think? How can we bring this in to the smart city discussion?
Maybe I'm not answering your question directly, but as I was listening to the conversation, two things popped up in my brain. One is that I don't think we can talk about this in isolation to other kinds of data collection that's already happening because of the session I went to earlier around national identity cards. If there's already a kind of national ID, which is a prerequisite, which has all kinds of biometric data that's collected within it that is also maybe transmittable to some extent, or data can be collected to some extent. Link that up to what you do in a city, link that up to how you move in a city, link that up to all different kinds of activities that necessitates a pause just to think about it. I mean, the ID cards in itself will have lots of privacy concerns already, and then you link that up to an actual body in motion, right? Actual body in motion and doing things. So that requires a pause. And then what if the national ID card is also linked up to your mobile phone? Or your mobile phone requires biometric in order for it to move forward. And then your mobile phone also has within it a compulsory panic button from January 2017, as is the case in India soon, right? Then what does that mean in terms of different kinds of data sets connected together? And you talked about access and public Wi-Fi access points, for example, making Wi-Fi available to everybody in the city, and it's actually a good thing. It's a really valuable effort to try and make sure that more people have access, regardless of whether you can afford it or not. But if the public access then has a precondition of you having to give up particular kinds of data before you can access, as in the case in Turkey, you need to have your name, your whatever, before you can access, then what does that mean in relation to then a city that's also completely linked up? And analysis is being made. So that's one piece, no? Like, we really do need to think about this also not in isolation in terms of just the smart city collecting what it needs to collect, but already what other things are being collected in the first place. That's one. And then the second thing that popped into my brain is actually what Malavika said also in the previous session. What existing rights-based frameworks are there in place already? So quite we've talked about privacy, and privacy is critical, right? I mean, it's really, it's highly dangerous, actually, to talk about smart cities without adequate privacy safeguards in existence. But that's exactly what is happening in many developing countries, Malaysia included. We have a terrible Data Protection Act that does not really talk about data protection at all in a material and meaningful way. So when you don't have that, and you are in the business of then say, let's link everything up, let's try and collect as much as possible, let's make decisions around this, and the problems of you talking about then some of these decisions are externalized, processed by algorithms there's not even a human intervention. Let's stop. Let's pause, yeah. Not to say that the intention of it is problematic. I think the intention of smart cities in really trying to solve particular problems of overpopulation, migration in the urban spaces, about distribution of resources, that's great. We need to do that. But whether this is the best way to do it when all of this is happening is like, and quite apart from privacy safeguards, there's also thinking about actually what other kinds of rights-based frameworks are there. For example, participation in local governance. Is there even local council elections, for example? If you don't even have that, then how do you even meaningfully participate in this conversation, really? At what level? Where do we go here? I mean, I'm not in that table having that conversation, or even, you know, being able to input into the framework, or being able to even say what my needs are at any. So these are existing mechanisms and things that it's almost like, I'm sorry I keep asking people to take 2 steps back, but I think maybe we kind of first have to take 2 steps back to see what's happening, and then, okay, so where do we go from here? Because, right, if these things are not in place, if you don't have checks and balances, if you don't have participatory processes already, it's almost like, then how? Here? I cannot, no? Only I can talk here, but a bunch of people cannot. So, yeah.
Eva, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, because actually, I think you made some really interesting point, because I think the right to privacy gets completely redefined, and this is what you were hinting on as well in a smart city, because originally, I mean, not originally, but one of the definitions we have of the right to privacy was coined in 1890 by Warren and Brandeis as the right to be left alone. And what does it mean to be left alone in a city where, for example, if you take the example of Singapore, the presence of CCTV camera and sensors mean you can literally be followed step by step. And the government is actually doing experiments, for example, to see how people would react in the case of a natural disasters or epidemics. But beside the fact that, you know, the mere fact of being in the streets makes you the subject of surveillance, there's also the questions of the services you're getting, and those claiming the right to be left alone, those claiming the right to refuse to participate, means that you will get less services. You were talking earlier about the fact that, like, you're creating smart cities for smart people. What if you're not smart? What if you decide to take a step back, actually, and to not participate? Does that mean the kind of quality of the services you're going to get are going to be lessened? And linking to that, there's the whole, so that links to the whole question of exclusion, right? And my colleague Alex was moderating a panel on smart cities recently, and someone in the audience just got up at some point and said, I'm blind. I don't think smart cities, as we build them at the moment, are going to be smart for me. And that's the whole question of priorities, right? So many cities at the moment are not accessible for less able people. And yet we're investing millions in building smart cities to provide better services for people who are equipped with devices. And yet, what about simply just building cities that are accessible for all? And just to respond to that point you were making about the ID system, I think the interesting thing is that if you look at the countries that are the most hungry and excited about smart cities, I mean, the top 2 will be India and China, which are the countries that are also the most excited about ID systems, as we've discussed in the previous session.
Good points. I've seen that there's some people in the audience who want to say something. I can bring the mic around. I think we have one here and one here. Oh, Tony, you're there. Excellent.
Thank you very much. My name is Johanna Westersson. I work at Swedish Amnesty on discrimination issues. I'm glad you raised this, Eva, because what I've been sitting here thinking about while I've heard you talking is this session was supposed to be human rights and smart cities, and you've talked a lot about the right to privacy, but there are so many other human rights that come to the fore here. And I'm thinking about the unequal access, how in a world and in cities increasingly digitalized, what happens with those people who are actually not online for some reason. And if I feel what I see, I'm Swedish, and what I see here in Sweden is that services are increasingly being privatized. Instead of going to the pharmacy, you're supposed to renew your prescriptions online. And what happens with old folks who don't know how to do that, or people who don't speak Swedish, or people who cannot read and write? And I think this is a really key issue to talk about. And this is also not something that we can leave to the private corporations, with all respect. But I don't think these groups that we're talking about are particularly interesting to the private enterprises. This is a matter of human rights, and therefore it has to be a matter for government and civil society. I also think that in the digital world, technology can be used to actually block access, deliberately or as a consequence, to some marginalized groups. And just very briefly, I just came from Malmö in the south of Sweden, where I was doing interviews with with homeless Roma people who come from other countries in Eastern Europe. Many of them sleep in cars. This is Paradise Sweden, Human Rights Sweden, right? Sleep in cars because there are no shelters, there's nowhere for them to go. In Malmö, the parking meters have been replaced so that you can only pay by card now. The public toilets are going in the same direction. What this means effectively is that people who want to pay, who have the money, but they only have cash because they support themselves by begging, effectively they're excluded from these public spaces. They're excluded from utilizing these public services. And you know, in the case of Malmö, this is being done very deliberately. So I just want some comments on this, what digitalizing actually means in terms of access. Thanks.
I think it's really good you raised this. We'll let the panel respond to this, and then we'll take a question over there. Maybe Johanna, you want to be the first one, as you specifically mentioned in there.
I do care a lot about these issues, so I totally agree with you. The group I'm mostly worried about is really the old people. That's maybe the biggest group that will have problems accessing, because the technology is still too complex. They're afraid for accessing a computer, so they have to find someone to do it. I see it on my old mother, I see it on many, many old people, and it's a huge challenge. Now, some technologies can actually help in that direction as well. A lot of the new systems actually uses voice recognition, so you can actually do certain services just by speaking to Alexa type of machine. Now there's another issue what Alexa stores about what you say, but let's not get that way. But you could have type of solutions that actually allows you to speak with it, and a voice interface is a much better solution than a screen interface for those type of solutions. But I think we need to take much more seriously the people that cannot access the technology, because it is a real issue. And if you speak with a city, many cities, they introduce the new technology. When they have a certain adoption, they take away the old solutions. And they probably do that too early.
Jack, you wanted to respond also?
Yeah, thanks for raising that. I was trying to wait for the moment to come in to talk about this, but I'm not sure when. So this will be my moment. I think there's a couple of things, no? One is, in my imagination anyway, smart cities is regardless of whether you have a device sometimes. Data is collected about you because data is collected about spaces, right? Who inhabits particular space, let me collect that data, let me then run that data, and let me think about how to manage this space better. And then in some instances, like what you're saying, it's where you have to submit yourself into a particular data set already before you're able to then access particular services. So whether this is in terms of a card or some kind of a credit system, etc., before you can. So it's a precondition issue. How precondition to the access of public spaces. Again, going back to this notion of a public space, right? Like who is a public space for, and what is this notion of a public? And let's gender this public space as well. Where are women's bodies in a public space? In many countries in the world, women's bodies are not supposed to be in public spaces. I think it was the research that you also mentioned, where a woman inhabiting a public space is very different. You go from point A to point B, it's not really a space for you to do anything more else. And in many spaces, a woman's place is in the private domain. There's only very specific legitimate purposes for you to engage in a public space. To go to the market, to send your children to school, to visit your in-laws, etc. And then when you breach these allowances or conditions, this female body is disciplined, usually through sexual harassment. Fair game. You shouldn't be in this space anyway. You're here, so I'm going to sexually harass you. So then there's two dimensions to this, which is interesting. The first dimension is then the illegitimate female body. What is this illegitimate female body, right? So I think I'm going to mention two, and I will use India as site-specific, simply because that's stuff that I'm familiar with. This illegitimate female body, one could be the female body that's really choosing just to loiter. Yeah? So there's a fantastic research that's being done about women's rights to loiter. Just to be in the public space, not to be productive, not to engage in any activities, just to hang out. And even that is a problem. A whole campaign has been run around women's right to loiter, and to loiter without being harassed. And I think this is important because it's again a conception of what we imagine the value of a public space to be. Must it be efficient? Must it be productive? Can it just simply be a space for you to just loiter? No? And that's something to think about. And what would a smart city do to construct such loitering spaces without having some kind of utilitarian drive to it? That's one. And then secondly, the illegitimate body is maybe the body of a sex worker who's already automatically criminalized. Or the body of a trans woman, whom in many places is automatically criminalized. Or maybe the body of a Roma person, whom the city doesn't want to see hanging around. So what happens in a smart city in relation to these bodies that are illegitimate or unrecognized? So either they're invisible, so they are not counted, and their concerns and needs are not included in terms of how you conceptualize what the city is supposed to be, who is supposed to serve, or they are hyper-visible in the data sets, in which case then the smart city, and I'm talking of the smart city like some kind of a robot. I don't mean that, yeah? I just mean like, you know, the whole evolution of this. But like, you know, they are hyper-visible, in which case then the initiative of smart cities will then serve to either segregate or eliminate. What does that mean in terms of who's in this space? So that's these two, you know, this notion of an illegitimate female body. That's one. The second is the notion of the vulnerable female body, right? So then this is the notion of public spaces as being unsafe. So the female body entering into the public space is automatically a body at risk and a vulnerable body. And this sits on existing assumptions and patriarchal assumptions. Ooh, I used the patriarchal word. A patriarchal assumption that, you know, women's bodies are not supposed to be in public spaces. If you are there, therefore you are vulnerable. So how do we deal with this? So again, the India example. After the horrific rape in 2012, the government said, oh my God, we have to make the city a safer space for women, yeah? So how do we do this? Let's come up with safety apps. Safety apps is the best way. Let's put a lot of money so that local people can also develop safety apps that's, you know, that's very responsive, and that's been a plethora of safety apps that's been developed. Also because there is a policy to say, okay, we need to have panic buttons by January 2017, so let's experiment, put money into it, blah, blah, blah. And what is the safety app? The safety app is basically trying to map the city so that the city becomes a safe space for women. Internet Democracy Project did an incredible research on a range of safety apps in relation to what are the data that it collects, how does it conceive of this notion of safety, and what are the privacy risks in relation to this. One of the features that is in this app is geofencing. So that means if you have this app, as a concerned member of your family, I can say that this is the area in which you should travel. Oof. If you get out of this area, an alarm would sound, and I would know, oh my God, you are being unsafe. I can help you. You put this, yeah, in an existing framework where women's mobility is already very, very much regulated. So you have this you have the super structural regulation that happens from the state to the individual, but you also have the social level of it. And what does this mean, right? In terms of actual relationships at different levels. But this is really conceived through a framework of safety on particular bodies. So what does that mean? And then you map that. But what it also do is then, on the backs of women's safety, it's introducing this notion that more data, more collection, more mapping of the spaces in which we occupy and what we do and how we move within it is better for women's safety and therefore better for everybody's safety. But it has deployed a technology that then normalizes surveillance, normalizes monitoring and tracking, and normalizes this paradigm and framework that's good for a healthy, working, functioning, efficient, wonderful city for all of the bodies. But whose body? What kinds of body? This body thing is actually a very, very critical question. Is this body basically a productive, cisgendered male body that participates actively in capitalism every day? Or is it also unruly bodies? I think.
Really important. Thank you. We had a question over there, then over here, then over there, then over there, then over there. There. All right. I'll try to remember the order.
So this is fantastic, Jacques. If you take a very similar situation and reframe that from the point of view of a government, and let's say it is a question of resource allocation. So the Pakistan Punjab government will have an app which, says, here are where the crimes are taking place. They geomap it and blah, 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 and they analyze it and they find, oh my God, actually 80% of the crime takes place in 20% of the whatevers, right? Street corners or something like that, right? So then they will deploy police and all of those resources in those particular 20% of the city blocks or something like that. Is that legitimate, and what are your thoughts about that? Similarly, many other things, the street bump application in Boston that was so heralded, that works on smartphones and it identifies where street potholes are broken, was great. Then somebody came along and said, oh my God, only rich people in Back Bay have smartphones, so this is not going to identify potholes in poor areas. Now, if you stopped there, that's a really bad situation to be in. But if you look at a city where we live, we are resource constrained, right? We probably have 2 garbage trucks for the whole city, right? And no people, and 1 person who checks for potholes. Now, if you analyze that data and you realize, okay, I'm getting automatic feeds on potholes on that area. Now let me deploy my 1 pothole finder in the areas I'm not getting it. Now I'm looking at this as a resource allocation problem, right? From the efficiency point of view. Just thoughts.
Thanks. Let's take a couple of more questions and comments, and then we bring you back to the panel.
Yeah, I think for me, this conversation is reminding me that the concept of intersectionality is not being used when it comes to looking at smart cities. Because again, we're not, the people, they're very simple solutions a lot of people with disabilities have around smart cities. A lot of people, even women who faced harassment or even physical violence, say just like light up some of the streets, light up some of these streets and we'll be fine. The app, so I think one is that. I think the other is all our work, and I'm trying to make a parallel between development work, human rights work, digital work, always errs on the side of only talking about harm, suffering, violence. So we always talk about, and we're always looking for the dangerous places and never thinking about the affirmative side of things. What kind of cities will make people's lives and constitute the idea of well-being, security in a very different way. Security is not just being free from violence. Security has a lot of other things. And then into that notion, we play in ideas of the normative family, the normative idea, patriarchy, and in a way that women who are not within those families are not worthy of protection. So women living on the streets, beggars, sex workers, they're not worthy of protection. The app is created for the family member to create the, surveillance system with the person. It's a very complicated system, and unless the digitizing world also engages with those ideas, we'll have produced another monstrous place where we're all living in. And I think it'll be too far ahead of its times to fix. And so I don't know who does it, but maybe that's a conversation that needs to be had.
Thanks. We had a comment over here as well.
2 quick things. One was, the idea of a smart city to me has always seemed ridiculous, because isn't that what governments are supposed to do in the first place? Isn't being efficient part of their job? Isn't cutting costs part of their job? That we're actually, as taxpayers, that our money is being used to surveil us more and more as a cost of the city becoming more efficient off of our backs. To me, that idea has always seemed ridiculous, this idea of smart, call it an efficient city, call it just a normal city and regular governance. Sexifying it doesn't make it a new thing. So that was just one comment. But the question I had was sort of on the intersectional point, to what extent, given that smart cities are architectures on, both on a technical level, it's the whole sort of technical architecture, but it's also physical space and architecture of buildings and, spatial arrangements. To what extent are all of your communities working with urban planners and architects? Because you could architect a surveillance panoptical infrastructure, or you could architect safe spaces and places that genuinely trigger engagement and communication. So I was just wondering to what extent you feel, to the extent we're all talking to each other, we're failing. We're not talking to people who aren't thinking of human rights. Like, what are we doing to reach out to communities that actually build this stuff on a physical level? Thanks.
All right, we had one more here, and then we'll bring it back to the panel.
Hey, my name is Paz Peña. I'm an independent consultant. I want to know, this is a kind of advocacy question. Do you think that that smart cities should be part of a kind of cybersecurity politic made by the state, or that is too risky for our data?
All right, thanks. Personally, I thought it was interesting that you brought up the issue of urban planning and architecture. I work for UN Habitat, which is a city agency. So we have very many urban planners, and everyone talks about urban planning, but very few people talk about technology. When you go to smart cities conferences, then people talk about technology very much. There are not so many urban planners. And here, I think, judging from the questions, not so many urban planners at all. And the discussions seem to be very separate. And I think that's really, it's a shame. You think, I live in Nairobi, which has horrendous traffic. We did a study a few years ago at UN Habitat showing that street connectivity and land allocated to streets in Nairobi is extremely low compared to many other cities. It's about 12% in the central area, should be about 35%. So of course there's traffic because there's literally not enough streets and there's not enough public transport. And digital technology could tell us that, but we can also just go out and see that actually we need some urban planning. So there's, I think that's, yeah, exactly. I think that's an important thing to take into consideration. But so we had some comments on mapping of street corners and potholes, and then we had the cybersecurity issue. Anyone from the panel who want to pick up those specific things?
Actually, if I can just jump on the intersectionality question and maybe to link with the planning and question. Actually, what's interesting is that for me, the first example of a smart city that was being developed was by Walt Disney. And Walt Disney actually had designed the most efficient possible city. And at the time, obviously, it wasn't so much about data collection, but largely about planning. How can we make the city the most efficient possible city? And the side to this was that the moment you retired, the moment you were too old to become like fully efficient in the city, you had to leave the city. That was part of the deal of living in that city, that you had to leave. And I think this is the problem, is that and this is what we've been discussing and addressing so far, is the fact that the moment you don't quite fit in, the moment you're on the side, you're on the march, being too old, being a Roma person, being just merely a woman, the services are not there to support you anymore. And this is what the potholes example illustrates, is that if you have a fancy phone and a fancy app, and if you have time to report potholes in your area, then, you'll get the best kind of services. Now, what about people living in areas, or just people who simply don't have time to participate? What does that mean for them? And actually, I think the problem is that we are seeing already so many examples of this. Like, obviously, there's the potholes example in Boston, but one of the horrifying examples I found is actually in New York City, where there's a public Wi-Fi. If you have an iPhone, you get access to the secure Wi-Fi. If you have an Android, you have an insecure Wi-Fi.
Whoa.
So I think I don't have an easy answer to the intersectional questions that are emerging, other than to say it's more urgent than ever before to have this debate, to have this discussion, and to make sure we have, diverse people in the room when we are planning this project. And just to quickly on cybersecurity, obviously I think it definitely needs to be part of this debate, because, we're not talking so much about it, but the reality of this data collection is that at the moment we don't know how to secure this data, and you know, we're talking about security and how the smart cities is there to make us more secure, but actually the reality of it is mass data collection isn't making us more safe at the moment.
You want to?
Yeah, I want to comment on two things. I think I will start with the city planning. I speak with quite a lot of city planners around it, specifically when you're talking about building a totally new city or a new city neighborhood. And there they really want to look at how can we build this safer, better, and how can we take this technology in consideration. The problem is that when you're building concrete, that is 10, 15, 20 years plans. And there are really no good way to predict where that will go. Will you need parking spaces at all in that city? Will you have shared autonomous driving, or will you have to have parking spots? They are really challenged for how to take those considerations in. So therefore it becomes a bit of, let's plan our city based on the past, and let's look at the smart city for how we will do the future. And that's a really crash between those two. So I think you're right, and I don't think it's easy to solve because of the different time horizon. And even worse when you are changing an existing city. Then the issue around surveillance. I think that's a super important one, because yes, it makes us less, we get less privacy. But it's proven that it actually has good effect on crime rates. If you look at Latin America, sorry, but it has been done. We have done this for a city. We have a city in Brazil, São José dos Campos. They put in cameras, and murder rate went down 18%, and the percentage of cases that was cleared went up significantly. I know that there are disagreements around this, but there were real improvements in that case. So you can get results out of it. Now, are we willing to sacrifice that privacy for that advantage? Maybe not. But that is a discussion that needs to be had. And that's coming to my real point. Smart cities are not about technology, and I represent the technology guys, right? But we see that maybe 15% of the decisions you have to take and the things you have to create to make a smart city is technology. 85% is policy, processes, operational models. And if you don't want to address those problems, you probably shouldn't look at a smart city at all.
Maria, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah.
From Latin America.
The fact it's what you say is totally true, but it's not the complete true, because you can have a substantial reduction in the areas where you allocate that technology, but the immediate effect is that relocalize to the next neighborhood, and at the end it's not effective. Again, you're talking about marginalization of certain communities where the fancy people with iPhones and safety app are safe in their neighborhood and the other ones are not. So at the end, I think that we need to be very careful in the solutionism that this bring to the discussion, because it's not just about like the ICT solution that the private companies or government or whoever with a very good intention that I'm not putting on question can have, but the reality is that what some of the questions highlight is the need to engage with a more traditional framework of analysis and bring experience from things that have been around for a very long time. So at the end, the technical solution can be, maybe, we will not say for sure at the beginning, a part of the solution, but it will not be like the full solution if you don't engage with the analysis of the real need of the community, how the measure that you take in this place will affect the whole environment and ecosystem of the engagement of the city, and what others alternative measure you can take that are more effective and with less harm of other rights and values that are still needed to have like an engagement in society. Because at the end, if we are just like preserving the right of a few to have a better quality of life, more efficiency, but we are leaving behind a lot of other population, it's not a smart thing to do. So the smart city, the first decision that it's for a smart city to do is how it's smart want to be in the sense of use of technology and how traditional still can be, and in that way being more human for the people that need to inhabit that city.
Kelsey?
Yeah, I want to jump in just on sort of two of those points because they were interesting. So first, I think there's an interesting question around if you have an iPhone and you're in New York and you're going to use one of the Link NYCs, you probably are more likely to be able to afford your own Wi-Fi connection. So you're not relying on public Wi-Fi. And so I think the point that you were raising earlier is that there's sort of the Jack brought up is that sort of as we try to use technology to solve problems, there's a real concern that the vulnerable populations will become more surveilled than anybody else, and that privacy becomes a right only for the rich and those who can afford it. And you need to, sort of security concerns flow from that, and there's a lot of really, we need to be aware of that as we're developing tools and as we're deploying them, and that sort of the, answer to traditional questions or to old questions and even questions of lack of access may not be digitizing everything and finding new ways and alternative ways to mix those together. And then sort of to the resources question and the street bump example, I think what was really instructive about that was that they rolled out this app, and so potholes were only being fixed where the young and rich lived. But the city realized that, and it halted the programming until it could figure out what to do, and it complemented it with a different system so that it was actively searching out places where the apps weren't doing, but it didn't stop using the app. It just combined it with better sources of data. It had a fuller picture. The city stopped and thought about it and realized that data quality and data accuracy were really important, and so they figured out ways to combine the two and use the tech to supplement it but not rely on it exclusively. And part of that is that they had the benefit of the resources to do that. But I think that's an important thing for sort of decision makers to keep in mind, is that technology can help be part of the problem. It's rarely, if ever, going to be the entire solution. And on that, I thought that also a really understated point in this conversation has been the importance of the underlying infrastructure, and that it's really easy for cities to go out and buy a flashy new tool and to sort of deploy street hardware and things like that that will give very obvious concrete benefits, but often we're better served if they go through and they do the work, the hard work to booster and bolster the underlying security infrastructure and make sure that the data is quality, that they're not making decisions based on bad data, that they have the full picture, that they can send folks out into the communities and have those discussions, and that they're going through step by step and making sure that if you're going to put a sensor network in a neighborhood, talk to the neighborhood, see what those people are doing, find different ways to communicate with them, see what their needs are. Sometimes they don't care about privacy, sometimes they do. Sometimes you need to educate, sometimes you need to let them make those decisions that they would prefer to know, where the next asthma outbreak is going to be, than, sort of this amorphous concern that maybe a MAC address will be captured if there's no camera, there's no audio, things like that. And so you need to allow room for all of these conversations at once. And then I had a different point, but I completely forgot what it was. The sort of key to all of this is that these are political decisions often, that we can have all of these conversations, we can talk to the urban planners, we can talk to the technology companies, but at the end of the day, the city decision makers are the ones that you need to persuade because they're the ones deciding if these tools will go in or not. And so to the extent that there are lack of elections or the political processes themselves are part of the problem, that's a different structural problem that we might need to continue attempting to tackle. But that is also a really important, I think, overlay on all of this discussion.
There were a couple of questions in the audience. So you have one there and one behind there and next to it as well.
Thank you.
Two in the back.
Thank you. Yeah. So I want to ask about the model of public administration that we are heading to, because you know that there are different theories about how public administration or government has been changing through years. So bureaucratic model, new public management, governance. So my question is, once you already have the smart city, which is the new role of government?
Right. We had two behind there also.
Hi, my name is Jasna. I come from Macedonia. So I'm a tech person myself, and I've done quite a bit of research, academic research on smart cities and IoT. Now listening to this discussion and considering also what the lady in the first line from Sweden said at the beginning, and if we talk about the intersection between smart cities and the advancement of technology, and human rights, and then all the layers that the society still has, you know, all the different people. Do you think that maybe technology is developing a little bit faster than what we are ready for at the moment? And then considering that and having human rights in the picture, do you think that maybe talking about smart cities and application of tech in all pores of society, maybe we need to kind of come up with smart human rights that will satisfy the change of technology being implemented in all of this? Just it's a thought-provoking kind of a thing. I just thought of this right now, so I thought to hear your opinion. Thank you.
Brilliant. Who wants to take that one? Smart human rights?
Okay, so let's take a hopeful view, no? We start from hope, yeah? And we start from hope from a few different points from also the previous conversation. One is that, and also the point that you made, it's actually hard to stop. And I think that's also something that I'm realizing. Once the technology innovation has come through, the only thing you can try and really do is to make sure that you have enough check and balances. And that's kind of the trajectory of things so far. So maybe one hopeful moment is this kind of cross-conversation that's happening between urban planners, architects, artists, actually, and some activists. And I know that some of this was happening in Malaysia at one point, thinking about urban regeneration in particular pockets. And it's interesting, the conversation that happens from there. But it does require a deliberate designing of a convening of spaces where unlikely people come together and have a conversation about what is this space for, and who do we want it to be useful towards, and how do we make that happen. And often, it doesn't work, but you try lah. That's phase one, then you try again, then you try again. But this kind of like cross conversation, bearing in mind that one's looking towards trying to fix problems of the past and the other is some kind of techno-driven, futuristic desire, maybe that also needs to go, comes back, no? Then the other one, the other hopeful part is also your question around, so then let's look at this as a data research geek point of view, right? What this also provides is an opportunity to collect data in which you can then use this data to really address some of the real problems like accessibility for differently abled people in a city, ensuring that resources is being deployed in efficient ways. So for this to happen, for data, meaningful, useful data collection to happen, then the back-end work needs to happen, right? So then the back-end work means that all of the other layers that was raised earlier, that there is check and balances, that you do actually have privacy protection, that you are relying on things like, that you're not trying to collect data that profiles, but it's basically data that, I don't know, aggregates in some way, la la la. So then the fourth one is about what is the role of the government? What do we want the government to do if smart cities are basically already running itself based on algorithms and decisions? You don't have to do anything. Ericsson is doing everything. In fact, Ericsson's not doing everything. Ericsson's computers are doing stuff. So then, what's the role of the government in the first place, right? So maybe let's maybe flip it around also a little bit. In that, you know, introduction of internet technologies have also introduced kind of innovative ways of participatory governance, right? Iceland had crowdsourcing of their constitution. So maybe we can also think about this, like, you know, crowdsourcing of what is your ideal city? Let's make sure that we are doing this in a way that is also not penalizing people who have no device access, but also other ways in which, like, you know, the usual public notice board pins outside libraries and public toilets. To get opinion polls, and then thinking about this as also important data sites that's not just digitized and blah, blah, blah. If that's where we're going, then maybe let's also think about other ways in which this can happen, and think about maybe now, in this sense also, do I bring it up? Yes, maybe. Okay, maybe then in this sense also some kind of a multi-stakeholder governance process might be innovated out of it, I don't know. You know, at a micro level, right? At a local city level, and what does this mean, no? And then put that in relation to that other idea as well of needing to bring different parties together. This is the hopeful Jack speaking, oh yeah, this is possible. And then smarter human rights. You know, do we need better human rights? I think that is kind of sort of happening right now. Like, yes, we have human rights frameworks, but we really need to think about how existing human rights then apply in an increasingly digital age. Like, privacy is a big one. big kettle of fish, which, yeah.
Okay. Any more comments from the audience? Okay. Or anyone else want to say something? Okay, we got two at the back. Let's start with the gentleman. Where's the mic? Oh, there was one more. You wanted to say something also? She answered it. Okay. While the mic's going, I think, I mean, a little bit of hope there is nice to hear in some ways. I always think of the example of Barcelona. It's been very much touted as a smart city in a kind of neoliberal way for many years. And they had a change of government about 2 years ago, a year and a half. And they're working really actively to try to redefine what is meant by the smart city in Barcelona. Big part of it is getting neighborhoods involved in governance through various digital platforms and making services more accessible to ordinary people, if you like, or the urban poor. So I think there are some hopes. No.
Mm.
Good afternoon. My name is Valeri Mrija. I'm coming from Kosovo. While hearing this discussion, one might come to idea that yes, we have a guilty person in our room. This is Ericsson here sitting with us, and we have somehow they and smart cities are guilty that we have all discussing about human rights, violation of privacy, etc. But at the same time, we are pushing our citizens, our clients, our users towards having new services, more efficient services, more participating in all this life, but at the same time are making them guilty for violation of this privacy. Somehow I think the discussion here, hearing from my perspective, will be like how we find new policies, challenging policies, because the terms of human rights is a little bit more than a century old, and now I think really we need to redefine our human rights, redefining new policies, how to cooperate, because the smart cities are to come. The question is how we face with them and how we create new policies in order to cope and to increase the inclusion. Not just making them guilty because of the advancement of the technology, but just coping with the technology.
We had one more over there.
It's technology.
Okay, here you go. My name is Nadia. I'm from Stockholm. I work for a women's rights organization called Kvinna till Kvinna. I have a reflection. I think we've touched upon this a little bit. But what I'm hearing when I'm listening to you is we're kind of problematizing the notion of smart cities and data collection, privacy, and so forth, which makes me kind of hear that you're mentioning a lot of the dimensions that we're already aware of, right? So we're bringing our preconceived notions of who we are and how we see the world into technology, and we're kind of, to some extent, reproducing what already is. So I was just reflecting when I was sitting here, the checks and balances that we're thinking of, are they the same as they would be to kind of, you know, work to whatever, fight patriarchy, for the lack of a more sophisticated expression, or does this new world or technology bring something else to the table in terms of opportunities? So are we kind of reproducing the power structures that we already have, but on a new arena, digitalization and so forth, or does this also bring new opportunities to create something else? I don't know if I'm making those thoughts clear-ish, but
it is.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Eva, you want to say something? Or Maria, you want to say something?
Yeah. The first thing that I would say is that we are not doing guilty of nothing, the companies. But the reality is that even human rights framework can have 100 of years. It took a lot of work to arrive to what the consensus that we have around that. So I will not throw that from the window, because it's really valuable framework. It had a concept of check and balance inside. There are multiple human rights in place, as someone in the first row remind us. We are not talking about just about privacy. We are talking about dignity, we are talking about equality, we are talking about freedom of expression, we are talking about the right to live in a democratic society that allows you to have opportunity to take part of the decision in some point. And just the consideration of the technology factor doesn't change or anything of that. The technology is a tool that you can put on the service of the fulfilling of those rights according to the balance that we need to decide democratically, again, trying to engage as much people as possible in the discussion. So when we are talking about this, we are not saying that it's not possible to do. And we are not making guilty the companies that provide the technology for going through this process of making smart cities possible. But what we are doing is that you cannot just be flash with the illusion of that the technology will solve the problems that the humanity have not been able to solve in 100 years of conversation about human rights. So what we are saying is that, okay, we have that framework, it's useful, just put it together with the other layers and into consideration and build a proper process to decide what we want to implement as part of this model of technology at the service of the city or at the service of the citizen of the city at the end. And to the second question that you were pointing out, I think that connected with what I just say, of course the technology gives you the opportunity to change maybe in a more radical and fast way the old concept. But again, that's related whether you take one step back, as Jack said several times today, and set this conversation with this multilateral, multi-stakeholder, whatever you want to talk, vision or engage, again, community. When we are talking about cities, we are talking about one of the more fundamental level of organization of any society, any country. So there is a lot of value in to try to rescue the experience of local engagement that we had before the technology arrived. Before the technology arrived, people was organized in the neighborhood, they talked with the neighbors, and they engaged in the community, and that's also a valuable experience of democratic engagement that we have lost because of the cities grow so big and the capitalism is so cruel, so everyone wants to fight for having a better job, better opportunities, and it doesn't have any more time to talk with their neighbor because they need to be efficient. So all that is relevant in the conversation if we want to change the paradigm and we want the technology to be a catalyzer to change the old paradigms.
So I've just been informed 2 minutes ago that we had 2 minutes left. So let me, just a few seconds for each panelist to say some closing things, and then we'll finish.
So I'll close actually by answering what you were saying. I don't think there is a dichotomy between technology and the need for progress. I'm originally from Paris. Paris used to be a very right-wing city for many decades. In, I believe, 1997, there was a coalition of the Socialist Party and the Green Party that was elected. They've been in power since. They've been in power for almost 20 years now. And the reason they've been in power is that they've changed the city. And how have they changed the city? They've changed the city by putting free bikes that are accessible to all. They've changed the city by developing green space, public space, car-free areas. They've changed the city by installing centers where you can have access to condoms, to HIV testing anonymously. It didn't take technology to radically change the city we live in. And this is why I'm hopeful, this is why I think I'm not afraid of the term smart city. I just think what makes a city smart isn't and I don't have anything against technology. What I have against is this systematic belief that data collection and algorithm will bring you the response that you need. I don't think this is how progress works. And just 2 seconds on what you were saying about, I do think the problem, this is a very specific problem that we have, is that instead of having the technology bringing new solution, at the moment it's still reproducing the problems we face. And we didn't get to speak about predictive policing, but sadly the example of predictive policing that have emerged so far is that we have data sets that are biased because the data we have on crimes, for example in the United States, comes largely from Afro-American districts. And so the predictive policing data and response that we get is just increasingly targeting minorities. So this is why this will be the motto of this year. We need to take a step back and rethink radically the way we use these technologies.
Thanks. Kelsey, some closing.
Yeah, so I think that all of that's good. I'm probably a little bit more optimistic about the capacity of these tools to do good in the world if we give folks structure and education, and we, the people who are deploying these technologies in many situations have nothing but good intent. They lack the tools and the understanding of sort of the downstream consequences. And I think one of the benefits of having these discussions over and over again is that we can start to disseminate our knowledge and sort of the wisdom of various communities to others, and that you can bring discussions about the balance of power and about privacy and about how we want to live in our public spaces down to a very local level in a way that it, is been before at other points in time. But I think that smart cities are a good catalyst for having these local conversations about local needs and desires and what the city and what the space can look like and how technology can help and how data can help, and how folks can make those decisions for themselves and for their communities in the best possible way. So.
This is a technology transformation, and of course that will transform much in the society, whether we like it or not. I think it's a great opportunity for doing much good. There's also big risks for doing much bad and for doing unintended bad. But that doesn't so much depend on the technology as the policies and how we actually govern that technology. And as a comment to that, maybe it goes a bit too fast. My last comment is just that this is as slow as it will go.
I think I have talked too much, so
okay.
In order.
Hello. Okay, I have 3 things I want to say. I think the first thing is that human rights as a framework is really important, and to bear in mind that human rights is really most important for those who face most discrimination and is most disempowered. So as an example, so this is where if you use human rights as a framework to begin with to have a conversation about smart cities, then it's supposed to serve the most discriminated and the most disempowered. So for example, in Philippines, they have this wonderful thing that's a huge public park. And what they do is they open the public park for homeless people to sleep in every night. That's the utility of a public space that is specifically designed. No? And then in the morning they come, yeah, I know you're feeling distressed by it. It's not great, but it's also acknowledging that Oh, okay, so it's tears of joy. But you know, that's something to think about, yeah? Like where are public spaces for, and who is supposed to be used for? And then you think about human rights is supposed to serve whom? Yeah, which kind of human? That's the first point. The second point in terms of reproducing discrimination or providing opportunities, as you said earlier, 80% of it is really around process and so on. And I also want to say, technology design is not politically neutral. There's also politics behind the design of technology, and that's part of the process as well. So to take that away from the equation is also maybe a false misnomer. So that's the second point. And the third point is around possibilities for innovation. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back to the multi-stakeholder governance process, okay? I think one of the most exciting things in terms of internet development and us thinking about governance is actually this. It's become normal for us to sit in the same space as private sector, as researchers, and as government to talk about the policy and human rights implication of particular technology development. And that is something to be celebrated in terms of how we imagine negotiation of power and negotiation of decisions. And I know it's like, you hear the word, you want to cry right now, but maybe there's something in there that is also an opening, no? It's a possibility to also reimagine how we are going to construct systems and processes of peer accountability, of holding each other accountable. So imagine what kind of a crazy world we want to live in. Yeah.
And on that, I'd really like to thank the panel. I think it's been fantastic, super interesting, and I hope we can have more discussions like this at other events like the World Urban Forum, which is in Malaysia next year, and things like that. Give it up for the panel. Thank you.